So let's just quickly synopsis where we're at this point. We've talked about DNA homologies, protein homologies, and we've talked about what evolution is. That evolution is the change, delta meaning change, in allele frequencies in a population over time. We talked about something called genetic drift and how genetic drift can change the evolution of a population, the allele frequency in a population over time. We talked about development. And we looked at how genes influence development. How can a gene and a change in a gene, right? How can, remembering that the triangle means delta for change, the Greek letter delta, change in gene, in the genes and gene frequency, and therefore, I should say, genes could lead to a change in structure. And eventually lead to a change in gene frequency and overall evolution. And we talked about the idea that this connection between development and evolution, we discussed that, and you were tested on the idea that there is a short term for this, which is evo-devo, evolution and through development, or development evolution, the link between evolution and development. All right, so, and by the way, the example we looked at, or examples we looked at, were, as far as the mechanisms for genes influencing development and therefore influencing body structure, etc., were the mechanisms that we looked at, the hows, were gene switches that can be turned on or off. And we looked at the Hox genes as an example of just small changes in frequency, number of Hox genes, their position, where the Hox gene was, actually related to how often it was expressed. And we talked about all kinds of expression control mechanisms, right? So we talked about things like microRNAs, that's the mu for micro RNAs. We talked about large non-coding RNAs. We talked about transcription controls. And of course, we also talked about gene switches, right? transcription controls. And translational controls. And you see why we needed to go into transcription translation so heavily, and why we spent so much time on that is because those are directly related to evolution and to the development of a creature from its single-celled origin to the trillion-cell organism that you look at, whether it be a bat, a bird, a human, or a dolphin. But now we're going to look at another homologous structures. Again, remember, homologous structures have links. They have inherited structures from their ancestors. And the thought is that if you inherit, I don't know, the number of phalanges you have, right? Your fingers, right? The tips of your fingers, and the number of phalanges you have that you inherited from some ancestor, from your parents and your parents' parents and parents' parents, going back in time. And if those numbers of phalanges are similar to another organism over here, number of phalanges are the same in this organism over here, and let's say a seal, and this is you, a human. They're going to be different, obviously, but they have the same number, let's just say, as an example. And you keep going back in time. They inherited their genes from their ancestors going back in time, and you inherited your genes from your ancestors going back in time. The thought is that everyone with that characteristic probably had some common ancestor that they're related to, that perhaps some other organisms are related to, that perhaps some other organisms are related to, some individual in their taxa. Going back in time, there's some common ancestor that we all shared that had that same number of phalanges. That same structure, whatever that structure is. So that structure, whatever it is, was inherited from a common ancestor far, far back. Now, each of these branches led to different organisms, different taxa, different groups, as either large or small changes happen over a short or long period of time. The changes allowed for different usage of the structures. The phalanges are used in different ways because maybe the bird developed wings and hollowed bones, and where the human didn't, or the mammal didn't. In any case, the point is that these evolutionary links, these homologies can help link these similar structures. That's what they mean. Homologous structures are similar structures, similarities between structures that are descended from a common ancestor. So when we have to think back about that other thing that we talked about earlier on, which is adaptive radiation. And we talked about that, again, homologous. What does homologous mean? Consider that all pentadactyl limbs, all limbs that have 5 fingers or 5 toes, all came from the same common ancestor. And it turns out that all vertebrates descended from some early amphibian. All right. And why do we consider an amphibian? Well, first, it makes logical sense. If life started The theory is that life started in, all life was aquatic at some point, right? But it couldn't take advantage of the land. It couldn't take advantage of the landmass. There was grass, there was food up there, there was land, there was even water in the sense of fresh water in lakes, right? And it could not take advantage of that fresh water in lakes because all life was in the sea. So in order to get from the sea to land and take advantage of the mountains, the hills, surely most of the earth was made of ocean, but there was a lot of land, there was a lot of niches, a lot of space that wasn't being taken advantage of, and probably a lot of food for a long time. There's probably a lot of plants growing out here, and perhaps there were some insects even by that point. But there's a group, these organisms, at some point, some predecessors developed the ability to walk on land. But in order to walk on land, they also had to be able to breathe oxygen from water. So they had to be able to do both. Breathe the oxygen in the water and breathe the oxygen in the air. So that took a transitional organism, right? And one really great possibility is an amphibian. And we can look at all kinds of other evidence that supports this. But the point is that an amphibian fits the mold perfectly because an amphibian spends a good part of its life in the water, and then it can spend time, and different amphibians can take time in and out of the water, and they can come out of the water for extended periods of times. And now even some amphibians now, like toads, spend a lot of time in the water when they're young, and then a lot of time on land later when they're older. There are other examples like lungfish that can breathe out air in the air, breathe oxygen in the air, and breathe oxygen in the water. So what you have is however it happened, you had some organism that started off in the water, developed some genetic mutation that allowed it to crawl out. These are the real X-Men, by the way. These creatures developed advantages that allowed them to take over a whole new niche, right? So they were able to spend some time out of the land, take advantage of the land, and come back to the water. And over time, they did adaptive radiation. That open niche, that open resources that allowed them to multiply without any impediment. There were no restrictions on land because they had no predators, probably few diseases. Maybe the sun was their enemy because they're used to being in the sun, so some mutation probably allowed them to resist the rays of the sun. But after that, there was absolutely no limit to where they can go on land, and there were no predators, so they could multiply in all kinds of numbers. And the longer they were able to stay on land, the better they were able to survive because all their predators were here in the ocean. They had all kinds of resources, food and water and space. They had no predators, so they radiated. They adapted and radiated. And why did they adapt? Because there were so many that all kinds of mutations were able to successfully survive until some mutation could take over another niche, for instance, of maybe a freshwater fish or what have you. So in the earliest of these ancestors that crawled out of the oceans had 4 legs, so we call them tetrapods. All vertebrates have a tetrapod as their ancestor. And all vertebrates have pentadactyl limbs. In other words, they have 5, penta means 5 fingers or toes, 5 digits. That's what digits by the way. That's what the word digit means, by the way. Is those how many fingers? And yes, the thumb is included in the digit. That's why we use digit instead of the word finger. So when you look at forelimb and hind limbs, it's either a radius and an ulna, or in a leg it's a fibula and a tibia, and fibula and tibia. It's a femur or humerus, depending on it's the arm or the thigh, right, in humans, as far as humans are concerned. They have the metacarpals and metatarsals. You see the same general body plan, right? Remember the Hox genes, the same general body plan, the same number of bones. So it makes sense that both the legs and the arms have everything's pretty much the same. The difference is there's small changes in their lengths, right, between the toes and the fingers, small changes in the metatarsals length and shape between the palm and the sole of your foot, right? Maybe they got thicker, some bones got thicker, some got shorter, some got longer. The wrist muscles and the wrist bones and the ankle bones also have exactly the same number. They change shape and size. Obviously, your ankle bones have to be tougher, thicker. Your wrist bones have to be more maneuverable. The radius and ulna, the fibula and tibia, the fibula and ulna actually became much longer and thicker, right? The radius and tibia are not as thick and long because the leg bones have to hold up a lot more weight. The same with the femur and the thigh. It has to be a really thick, heavy bone. The humerus in the upper arm has to be big, but not as big and thick. So the point is that even in our own body plan, even in our own bone structure, we had to have some changes between the upper limb and the forelimb, the arms, and the hind limbs, the legs. Well, the same thing happened. These similar changes happen with birds because they're more extreme. See, there's the bird's shoulder blade. There are the fingers. The bird's fingers are the longest part of the edge, the very tips of the wing. These bird wings mostly are finger, and all the hand bones, the rest of the hand bones, the metatarsals, tarsals, fibula, can all be identified here in the wing. And of course, this would be the humerus in the human upper bone, and you can find these same structures down here in the legs of the bird. A mole has a similar structure, right? You can identify all the common bones between the human, the bird, the bat, the dog, the seal, and all humans. So there's the human bones and there's seal bones. You might say, well, what about the thumb? Well, the thumb just is a different shape, right? So the thumb is there. It protrudes out on the side. It has a slight difference in the way it hinges, so it allows us to grasp things. That gives us an advantage. But a dog's front leg, a dog's 5 bones, are almost as if they're walking on their fingertips. So their bones are thicker there at the bottom, and some bones may be shorter, very short. So in any case, the point is that the bones are used in different ways in all these organisms, but they have the same structures. They're just changed in shape. They've changed in size between them. Obviously, in a bat's wing, the fingers, which are the part of the wing that flaps, are much longer, right? Thinner. A bird's wing is longer and thinner, but then they go straight out. They don't fold in like a bat's wing does. So they change the shape of the joint. And these finger bones are all the bones in a bird are hollow. I think if you use your heads, you could answer these this question for each of these, you can take a look at the structures, and they gave you an example with the bird wing, that the forelimb shaped aerodynamic lift, the feather and feather attachments. You see, this is how this particular bone structure was adapted through evolution, through micro changes over time, or through some macro change. Some mutant was able, or many mutants over a long period of time were able to change to be able to form this structure. And we have found transition fossils, as we discussed earlier. There have been fossils found that, in fact, the gentleman that came up with the word dinosaur in the 1800s for all the lizard-like creatures that had a set of fused bones in their lower back, he called them dinosaurs for the word dinosaur, dino meaning terrible, the Greek word for terrible, and saurus for lizard. So it's two Greek words coming together to form one dinosaur. That gentleman that named the dinosaurs also got a chance to see the fossil that had the characteristics of a lizard, bony teeth. So imagine a beak. I've shown you the picture in previous videos of a lizard with feathers. There are these transition fossils that lead us to believe that these changes that help the bird wing form its ability to fly, give the bird its ability to fly, developed over time. So you could look at each of these and come up with ways in which this mole limb has been changed to be able to dig through moles. I don't know if you know this, but moles dig into the earth. They live in hollows that they create in the earth. Bats obviously fly, but they fly differently than bird wings, right? They don't have feathers, so think about it. How is this different? Dogs obviously use their front legs to run or walk, perhaps. They're not going to pick up a pool stick the way you might see in some silly painting. A seal's flipper has been adapted to swim, and what kinds of changes happened here. And obviously, human arm has been adapted to pick things up, manipulate tools, and throw things. So it's no longer used for running the way a dog's leg would be. So I explain homology in the pentadactyl limb is evidence of adaptive radiation. Well, we talked about what adaptive radiation is, and that's the idea that niches, and I just described it up here. You can rewind the video and think about the idea that niches, these empty, predatorless, right? No predators for the particular animals, plenty of resources, allowing all kinds of mutants to survive for a long period of time. So what that leaves is this genetic variation, these characteristics to survive from one generation to the other, and then as that means that some of those individuals that can then take fresh water might end up filling in the space of the fresh water. Later, those that can climb mountains go up into the mountains. Those that can climb trees go into the trees. So the idea that we all started with five limbs, or limbs with 5 digits, right? And that's the beginning, the first creature that came out. Then as individual groups, individual populations were isolated over long periods of time with all their various mutations, you have all these other niches being filled in. The high trees and the ability to fly, the underground, the running long distances, the trees. The human arm is adapted to swing, to climb, right, to grasp things, and obviously to swim, to go back in the ocean, maybe grab some resources that were in the ocean that weren't up here or into large freshwater lakes to get fish that might have adapted there. So there's evidence here that we all share these common characteristics. Not all creatures on the planet have pentadactyl limbs, just vertebrates. So here they ask you to think about something strange, right? The idea of homology again, inherited behavior of animals, similar to courtship, nesting rituals, etc., that somehow there's going to be a degree of relatedness between organisms that share similar behavior. There's a couple things to think about here. When we look at humans, we tend to think less about evolution with humans than we do with other organisms. But if you look at humans, if you have a certain tradition in your culture that you share with another culture, we start wondering, are those two cultures related, or did they develop this behavior independently? For instance, a good example might be pyramids. Pyramids were built by the Aztecs and in Peru by the Native Americans there of South America, and even the mound builders here in the United States built giant burial mounds, and pyramids were also built in Egypt. So then the question is, were the pyramids that were built, were they influenced with from each other? Were the cultures related to one another, or did the idea of the pyramid just develop 4 or 5 times throughout the history of humankind? And you could repeat this with every kind of cultural trait, having only one wife versus having many wives, having a lady who's in charge of the there are cultures in South America, for instance, and in Native American cultures, where the females were in charge of the government and running things, and the males were in charge of certain other functions. But that's not true of a lot of cultures on the planet. So you wonder, is that because the different cultures developed this paternal structure independently, or was the paternal structure shared by some and inherited from some common originating culture, and then this other culture then evolved a different way of doing what they do? So often cultural anthropologists will look at different cultural traits and ask how related is one culture to another, and could one culture have influenced another? Could they have inherited an aspect of their culture from another culture? Could the parent of one culture be another culture? So when you think like that, culture is about behavior, the foods you choose, the music you listen to, the kinds of houses you build, etc. Well, animals, we don't really talk about animals having a culture, but they do have behaviors, right? So they form nests in trees, or they form nests in the ground. Are they complicated nests, or are they simple nests? Are they social, or are they solitary animals? These are all behavior and that are inherited. A wolf doesn't. A wolf might learn certain behavior, hunting behavior. Cats certainly do by playing. So does orcas. Orcas will learn by playing how to hunt. But then the question comes in: what about things like a wasp? How does it know how to build a nest? How does it know how to build this beautiful geometric shape? And bees, they don't learn. It's not like they have little teachers with little schools where they learn how to build these things. They're born with the knowledge of doing what they do. There are certain small aspects, just like with the Hox genes, where the later genes, the genes in the back of the chromosome, influence the genes upstream from that particular set of genes. Small changes can lead to big changes. Small changes in the DNA can lead to big changes in structure. Most small changes in DNA can lead to big changes in behavior. So behaving a certain way, liking a certain thing, makes it so that you tend to build blue nests. So you go and spend all your days looking for blue pieces of ribbon and plastic and what have you to come and bring and build this nest so that you can attract the female. Why is the female attracted to blue? It had that mutation, and that was a successful one. And the idea of having a male that has an instinct to build a complicated nest ends up being an advantage, because presumably the nest allows the more eggs to survive and become productive adults in a population. So the question then comes in with homology of behavior. How could certain behavior like courtship and nesting rituals, etc., how can that, right, show relatedness? Well, if it's something that's genetic, if the behavior is genetic, then one can presume then that it was inherited from someone. So if the more similar the behavior, the more likely that there's some genetic component that was inherited from a common ancestor. So you have to think about behavior in animals very much as being inherited, and if they're inherited, they can evolve. You can have mutants that don't do that don't behave in the way that most of that particular population might behave. So you have to consider something like a penguin. Most birds fly. But theoretically, some ancestor of a penguin decided to try to swim to get fish, or maybe dove into the water to get fish, but after a while decided to stay underwater for a little longer and grab more fish, and there were less competitors in the water at the time. Then they came out and flew around a little bit, and over time, more and more of its progeny were able to stay underwater longer and longer, and soon they lost the ability to fly, and they decided to make nests on land. Think of the emperor penguin versus the penguins further north, right? Those emperor penguins have this behavior where the males tend to the egg all winter long while the females are out gathering food to bring back to the nest. They build up their energies and bring back food for the young when they hatch. Then they all march back off to sea. That behavior of where they go to group to take care of their young, of the female going out and gathering food, is unique to the emperor penguin. And so if there's another group of penguins that ended up doing a similar behavior, you would wonder, are they related? Did they inherit some genetic component that allows them or pushes them towards nesting in that way and behaving in that way? Now, very much like the pyramids, the answer does not have to be they inherited. It does not have to be that they evolved from a common ancestor. It could be that they developed that behavior independent of the other, right? So when you look at a butterfly learning to fly, a butterfly flying, and a bat flying, and a bird flying, butterflies, birds, and bats, let's just use birds. Butterflies and birds are not closely related genetically. They develop the ability to fly separately. The way the structures they use are completely different. They're analogous structures, the same function, same behavior, but different structures. So when you're talking about homology of behavior, the behavior can be inherited, but it doesn't have to be. So you have to collect evidence. You have to use a scientific method. You have to ask questions. You have to design an experiment. You have to collect evidence. You have to compare different sources of evidence. You have to make sure you have to try to find trends, find patterns in the evidence. And if the evidence all leads you to support the idea that they're related, then you accept that they're related for now until you get further evidence that might contradict or help support that concept. Remember, science is indeed fluid, and it changes, the understanding changes as the data comes in. So when you look at homology behavior is sometimes used to indicate a degree of relatedness, that is how we would be able to answer that question. You should be able to put that in your own words, hopefully. All right, thank you.